Well, dear church, it's the third Sunday in the season of Lent now. And of course, we began the Lenten season that first Sunday of Lent with the obligatory story of Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness as he prepared for his ministry. But once we get beyond that first story in the first Sunday of Lent, we enter into this middle zone of sorts. When we move from our usual gospel readings from Matthew and hear almost exclusively from John's gospel until we hit Palm Sunday. And the thing is, we do this because in the early church, they used these particular stories from John's gospel that we hear to prepare new converts in the faith as they prepared for their baptism, which of course would happen on Holy Saturday, late into the night, as they were baptized there at the vigil of Easter, and then would celebrate their first Holy Communion with the community on Resurrection Sunday. And so we hear all these stories that they used for instruction in our Lenten journey now. And of course, last week we got the first story from John's Gospel. That unique story of nighttime Nicodemus as he visits Jesus and experiences this new birth from above, as the Gospel tells it, as he began to follow Jesus and figure out what this Jesus way was all about for him and for the world. And now we get the next story from John's Gospel. It's another unique story, only found in John's Gospel, the story of the woman at the well. And as we think about this story today and ponder what it might mean for us as God's people, I want us first to remember a few things about John's Gospel in general. Because John offers a very unique perspective, the way John tells the Jesus story. It's almost entirely different from the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For those three Gospels share a lot of common stories. The timeline is almost identical. Even some of the phrases are verbatim, the same in the Greek in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But not so with John. John's Gospel follows an entirely different timeline and has a whole slew of entirely unique stories that we hear nowhere else in Scripture. And even the Greek language that it is written in reads very differently than Matthew, Mark, and Luke as well. For John can be poetic in ways that the other Gospels often aren't. John can be introspective in ways that the other Gospels often aren't. And John is often very symbolic and metaphoric in language in ways that the other Gospels aren't. And today's story is a prime example of the symbolic, mythological storytelling that John employs to reveal who Jesus is and what Jesus is about in our lives and world. But when John tells this story of the Samaritan woman at the well, it's thought that John is not recalling a literal time when a literal Samaritan woman met Jesus literally at Jacob's well. I mean, there may have been some encounters that inspired such a story. But it's almost certainly a narrative construction, a way of telling a story that invites us into a deeper truth about who Jesus is as the Christ, as one who brings God's healing to some of the deepest divisions of our world. Not unlike the deep cultural, religious, and historical divisions that separated the Jewish people from the Samaritan people. For the first layer of symbolism that comes to us when the author tells the story in this way today is, first of all, that the story happens at a well of all places. Which, if we reference the Hebrew scripture story, some of the patriarchal narratives that Jesus and his disciples would have been familiar with, we would do well to remember that meeting at a well in the stories of Scripture is often a sign of unity that is about to come. For Isaac met his future spouse Rebekah at a well and joined families. And Jacob met his future spouse Rachel at a well and then joined families. And even Moses met his future spouse Zipporah at a well as well. So there's that symbolic layer that undergirds this story from the get-go, the meeting at the well. But then we note the broader location where this story happens. In Samaria. Now, Samaria would likely have not been a friendly place for someone like Jesus, because 1,000 years before he lived, we must remember that the people of God was split into two kingdoms, northern and southern. The north would eventually become Samaria, with Samaritans as its residents, and the southern kingdom would become Judah, with Jews as its residents. But the thing is, Judah in the south, that's where Jerusalem was, with the temple and all its religious power and prestige and practices and history that happened there. But Samaria didn't have any of that. And so when they seceded from the other tribes, they kind of adapted their religious heritage that they initially shared, and then they decided to kind of meet in dispersed groups, oftentimes in higher places up on mountains where God's presence was thought to dwell, because they didn't have a temple to meet in like the southern kingdom did. And even though the north and the southern kingdoms were both part of the great Abrahamic lineage, they both traced their lineage to Jacob, whose name became Israel later. The thing was, they both had little control over some of the larger movements of the region that happened over the following 500, 600, 700 years. For first, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians. And when the Assyrians came in, they wiped out the people there. They broke them up. The Samaritans who were living there had been shipped off in exile. And the way the story is told, the Assyrians brought in 5 other nations to intermarry with them in an attempt to erase their social, religious, and cultural identity as God's people, which of course changed their social identity irreparably, changed their religious practices. It even changed the dialect of their language that they spoke. And they became to be known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And as much as the southern kingdom soldiered on confidently for a few generations, they were also not spared from the wrath of these regional superpowers either. For they too were conquered and exiled, this time by the Babylonians. And as the keepers of the temple practices there from the southern kingdom, even though they were shipped out and moved away, they held ferociously to the religious observances that they could in order to preserve what little bit of their tradition that they were able to. And it's thought that it was this period of history that birthed some of the kosher food practices and stricter Sabbath observances that we even see continued in Jewish tradition and faith today. Of course, eventually the powers of the region changed yet again, and many of those exiled people from the southern kingdom were able to return home, return to Jerusalem, start things again. But the divisions between Judah and Samaria were deeper than ever. And even then, some 600 odd years later, when the Gospel of John comes to be written, we continue to hear that this division remained, as stated in today's gospel lesson, when it says, Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. And so when gospel writer John tells this story of a Jesus, a Jewish man, who meets a Samaritan woman, who symbolically had 5 husbands, the 5 nations that Assyria brought to intermarry and corrupt the Samaritans, and meets her at Jacob's well, of all places. The symbolism can't be ignored. It seems the writer is trying to reveal to us the truth of a God who brings healing and wholeness so deep that it can make right religious and social divisions that span the better part of 1,000 years or more. Sir, give us this water, she says, that we may never be thirsty again. For we, the hearers of this gospel, are like that Samaritan woman. We, too, are recipients of the grand effort of God to overcome all obstacles that stand in the way of the true healing that we need in our world, even if those obstacles are millennia in the making. And we then are invited in our day now to follow her lead with a similarly faithful response of sharing such good news broadly. Not as proselytization concerned with conversion, but rather perhaps as the taking on of a posture of reconciliation and restitution and reparation that allows the healing presence of God to do what it does in our lives amidst our world that so desperately needs such healing this day. And so it's my prayer for us that in this Lenten season, in this time when divisions continue to pull apart the fabric of our humanity, that we, like the Samaritan woman, might be as bold. Might be as bold in our relationship with Jesus, be as bold in our relationship with the wider world, as we together drink of this living water that God brings, that heals the things we so deeply need to be healed. Indeed, God, give us this water, that we may never be thirsty